A little bit of, it's interesting on the telecast, these are summer reruns that were shown actually earlier in the year, and the ones we're seeing right now are summer reruns. Would you say that the timing on this program for a rerun is pretty good? There's all of the attention is focused in on Jerusalem. Of course, as soon as President Clinton gets back from Japan, I mean, he's going to solve the insoluble. There won't be peace in the Middle East. He'll usher in the millennium. Everybody will be happy and dancing in the streets. Well, don't hold your breath. They may be in the streets, but they probably won't be dancing. There may be a lot of things going on in the streets. It is very interesting in terms of what is happening and going on. We'll have to see the specific details. One of the things to realize, of course, is that some have compared what's going on in the Middle East, or the Middle East talks, to the talks held at Camp David when President Carter was president. We had Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat of Egypt, and we had those talks back in the late 70s. Several significant differences, one of which is that both Begin and Sadat were very strongly entrenched leaders at home. Begin had a whopping majority in Israel's parliament, and he was able to push the treaty through with an overwhelming vote. He had a very strong majority. He was very popular and was very much in control. Sadat in Egypt was running very much of a one-man show, and he had very strong control. And of course, the fact that the United States made a deal at that point that has cost the U.S. government $4 billion a year ever since. The money we promised Israel and Egypt if they would sign the agreement, and we've been paying on it ever since. $4 billion for the last 20, what has that been, 22, 23 years, something like that, that we've been running that through. If you saw the headlines in the paper the other day, it was something to the effect that peace in the Middle East may cost the United States $40 billion. We're offering them big bucks. But the problem is, of course, coming down to Jerusalem. What they were discussing back at President Carter's Camp David meetings was giving away part of the Sinai Desert and a few other things. Now they're discussing Jerusalem. Israel said, the Palestinians said, we demand Jerusalem. And Israel said, well, look, there's a couple of Arab villages out on the east side of Jerusalem. Tell you what, we'll just stretch the city limits out. We'll take that part in, and then we'll give it back to you, and we'll call that your part of Jerusalem. Well, as you may suspect, the Palestinians did not think that was a good idea. They didn't want a couple of Arab villages out the other side we'll call that Jerusalem, and we'll give it to you. No. They want the line drawn just where it was in 1967. They want control of the old city. And of course Israel says, no, that's the part we're keeping. That's what we're not giving away. We'll give you, some suburbs that have been built in the last few years, but we're not going to give you Jerusalem, the real heart and core of the city. Because, like with a lot of cities, as the city grows and things move out, we got suburbs that never were historically part of that city. They've only been built up in the last few years. That's what Israel has offered to the Palestinians, and they're not willing to take that. If Yasser Arafat were to agree to a solution that would allow Israel to keep control of the old city, he'd be tarred and feathered when he showed up back in Palestinian territory. That would not be accepted at all. If Prime Minister Barak came up with a deal to give away the old city of Jerusalem, his life wouldn't be worth a plug nickel, I mean, literally. It's a situation that will be interesting just to see, because I think what will be interesting is in the aftermath of these negotiations, there will be probably some indication as to whether things are going to speed up or whether some things are sort of the pot is maybe the heat has been turned down a little bit. I think it's going to be very interesting because they're now getting to the issues that really are at the heart and core of what's going on in the Middle East. Now, I didn't have any idea what telecast was going to be played today. I'd scheduled a telecast. Normally, when the videos come out once a month, there's one in there that includes several telecasts. And I don't generally select the particular telecast. They're whatever telecast they sent out, and whoever's handling that, Mr. Harmdirk's over here, well, he'll pick a telecast off the tape. When it's interesting, very rarely, we often have telecasts scheduled in Dallas and Gladewater on the same Sabbath. Virtually never have we had the same telecast played in both places. We did today. Interestingly enough, the other thing that was interesting, I thought when it started playing in Dallas this morning, Mr. Ames came on with his topic, I thought, oh no, there goes my sermon. That was what I was going to talk about. Well, I'm still going to talk about it, but I'm going to cover some things. There will be maybe a certain amount of overlap, but I think there are a number of things that we can build on and look at. I want to turn our attention back to Luke chapter 21. Because we're in a time when it is important that we focus on some of these things and understand what's happening in the world around us. Luke chapter 21, as we'll pick it up in verse 5. You know, Luke 21 is the parallel account to Matthew 24 and Mark 13, and we often go through Matthew 24, but I'd like to focus our attention a little more clearly on Luke today. Luke 21 in verse 5, Christ and the disciples had been coming through the temple complex, and as some spoke of the temple, some of the disciples, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, Jesus said, "As for these things which you behold, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And they asked him, saying, "Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass?" Now, let's stop and look at that a little bit. The temple area over in Jerusalem now, you hear about what's called the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall. This was not part of the temple in the sense of the temple building or the immediate walls there in the courtyard. This was the Western Wall, or a retaining wall. What King Herod did during his reign was to expand. In fact, he virtually tripled the size of the Temple Mount. You know, if you've seen pictures of Jerusalem and the immediate environs, you realize that the country is very rugged. You've got hills and valleys, and it's a very sort of a rugged terrain that way, with ravines and with hills all around. And that's the way it was around the Temple Mount. And so it was restrictive in terms of the number of people. Herod wanted to launch a great building project and to expand the temple. So what he did was he built this huge retaining wall that then hauled in dirt and rocks and filled out, leveled off that area of the Temple Mount and paved the area. So he virtually tripled the size. It's almost 40 acres, I think like 37 acres or something, that is the top of the Temple Mount. And it went from a little over 13 acres up to 37. So it was a massive change in that regard. And it's part of that retaining wall that is actually what's left. All of what was on top, the buildings, the building, the porches, all of the temple itself, the various apartments for priests and storage rooms, all of these things, all of that was leveled, all of that was destroyed, all of it was gotten rid of, and of course the Arabs have built their edifice there now, and has been for hundreds of years. So Christ was talking about the destruction of that temple, as magnificent and as great as it was. Now, one of the things that Matthew brings out that is not apparent from Luke's account is that Actually, the disciples asked Jesus a twofold question. Matthew 24:3, they said, "Tell us, when shall these things be?" Luke records that. "And what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, Luke does not mention that part of the question, but Matthew shows that that was part of what they asked him. And Christ then began to go through, and he talked about how many will come in my name, acknowledging me as Messiah. And he says, don't follow after these people. Many will come in my name. You know, Matthew 7 tells us that in Matthew 7:22, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? In your name have cast out demons. In your name have done many wonderful works. See, people can come in Christ's name, and they're doing this in his name and that in his name, and they are claiming to represent him. And of course, as Jesus brought out in Matthew 7:23, then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity, you that practice lawlessness. So there are many who come in Christ's name without his message. Then it goes on in Luke 21:9, you will hear of wars and commotions. Don't be terrified. These things must first come to pass. The end is not by and by. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, great earthquakes in different places, famines, diseases, pestilence, great fearful sights, great signs shall there be from heaven. But before all these, they shall lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Luke's account again records a number of things. One of the things that Luke does not make quite as clear as we see back in Matthew's account is exactly the time frame, because Luke mentions the false Christs, the wars, the famines, the diseases, and then in verse 11 he also mentions right in that context great fearful heavenly signs. But he says in verse 12, before all of these, before all these things have completely happened, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. You see, Matthew brings out in Matthew 24 that as you go down through the account in Matthew 24:29, it's immediately after the tribulation of those days, when the sun will be darkened and the moon not give her light and the stars fall, the powers of heaven shaken. You see, the tribulation occurs before and not after the heavenly signs. Luke puts in this statement that before all these, in other words, specifically the heavenly signs, this persecution will begin. It's a religious persecution. It talks about delivering people up to the synagogues, in other words, the established religious authorities. So it is a religious persecution. It will also involve the authority of the civil government. Now, the immediate context of Christ's statements here flowed from his original statement that this temple that you see and are so impressed with will be completely destroyed. It'll be destroyed. It'll be wiped out. Not a stone left standing. And this really took them aback. And as we saw in Matthew 24, they telescoped two events together. They telescoped the destruction of the temple together with the return of the Messiah and the establishment of the kingdom. Now, Christ went through and he described things because you see the events that set the stage for the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D. were in themselves a type of end-time events, the events that will serve as a prelude for his return. Now let me show you a little more evidence of that back in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 4. Ezekiel 4 and verse 1. Ezekiel, of course, was a Jewish captive. He was in exile there by the river Kabar, which was down in southern Mesopotamia in the vicinity of Babylon. Now, the house of Israel had been taken captive by the Assyrians over about 130 years before Ezekiel is writing. They had been taken captive way up hundreds of miles north of where Ezekiel was, up in the area between the Black and the Caspian Sea. Now, they'd been in captivity all this time. Now there have been Babylonian incursions that have brought groups of Jews to Babylon. And yet Jerusalem has not yet been destroyed. There's a puppet king, Zedekiah, who had been placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar and was sort of dancing to Nebuchadnezzar's tune at that time. And once he quit dancing to Nebuchadnezzar's tune, Nebuchadnezzar went in, destroyed the city, and destroyed the temple, and took Zedekiah captive. But that hadn't occurred yet. Now notice here in Ezekiel 4, verse 1, Ezekiel, Jewish captive, down in the area of Babylon, is told, "You also, son of man, take you a tile, piece of ceramic tile, and lay it before you, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem. Lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it. Set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Moreover, take you unto you an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between you and the city, and set your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege to it. This shall be a sign," to what? "A sign to the house of Israel." Ezekiel was told that he was to, in effect, take this piece of tile and make sort of a little model city. Like he was playing with little toy soldiers, and he sets it up and he builds his little fortifications around it, and he sticks all of his little soldiers around, and he fixes this thing up. And, people must have come by and sort of scratched their head and looked at it and said, "Ezekiel, what in the world do you think you're doing? He's here, see, outside this little village of captives of the Jews, and he's busily fixing this up, and he goes about it for a period of time. He gets it all fixed up. And yet God says, this shall be a sign to the house of Israel." You see, the prophecies in Ezekiel directed to the house of Israel are for the end time, because the house of Israel had been in captivity for 130 years when Ezekiel was writing. The sign for the house of Israel in the end time is not the events surrounding the fall of Samaria. It is the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem contains the events and the kinds of things that are types of the events for the end time, the events prior to the return of Jesus Christ. Now, let's look a little further. There is a book in the Bible that is a direct prophecy of the events of the tribulation. It is the book of Lamentations. Lamentations was written, as we have recorded here in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, describes the death of King Josiah. Josiah was the last righteous king of Judah. And God had made a promise to him through a prophetess that Judah would not be destroyed in his lifetime. It would be destroyed, but not in his lifetime, because he was a righteous king who had really sought God. But the people as a whole hadn't truly learned a lesson and repented. Well, when Josiah died, everybody who believed God knew this was not a good sign. Because if you're told, as long as he lives, everything will hold together, but when he's gone, it's over. You're going to want to see him live a long, long time. Well, Josiah died, and we're told in 2 Chronicles 35:25, and Jeremiah lamented for Josiah. And all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel, and behold, they are written in the Lamentations. Now, I wonder where that is. Well, you turn back to the very end of the book of Jeremiah, and in our English translations, you notice that right after the book of Jeremiah, the very next thing is a book called the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Now, we're told back in 2 Chronicles 35 that Jeremiah wrote these down. He wrote them in the Lamentations, and they were made an ordinance in Israel. In other words, they were made part of the Bible. Now, Lamentation starts out, Lamentations 1:1, how does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces? How has she become tributary? Verse 3, Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, because of great servitude. She dwells among the heathen. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. Now, as you go through the book of Lamentations, it is a prophecy. Jeremiah wrote it when Josiah died. It is a prophecy of what was going to happen to Judah and Jerusalem. But Ezekiel tells us in Ezekiel 4 that the events that were going to happen to Jerusalem are a sign to the house of Israel. So the book of Lamentations, while it is prophetic of the historical things that did happen to Judah and Jerusalem, you know, Jerusalem was destroyed twice. The temple was destroyed twice. Once by Nebuchadnezzar and once by the Romans. Interestingly enough, both destructions occurred on the exact same day. The 9th day of the 5th month. In other words, this time of year. This is, we're quite close to that anniversary. So, you know, about the second time around, this begins to tell people something. This was not good. Jesus Christ talked about a future destruction of Jerusalem to his disciples in that day. But he described that future event that was going to occur to Jerusalem, which did occur in 69, 70 A.D., as a type of the events that would set the stage for his return. And you see, this ties in with the Old Testament prophets. Ezekiel points out that the events that were going to happen to Jerusalem were a sign to the house of Israel. The lament for Josiah, which is a prophecy of what was going to happen in the course of the next few years to Jerusalem, stretches beyond what happened anciently. It is a prophecy of the events of the Great Tribulation. Now, the things that are going to happen there in the Middle East, clearly Christ makes plain that much of end-time prophecy is going to center around the events in Jerusalem. Going on in Luke chapter 21, Luke 21, he describes the persecution, religious persecution, Luke 21, and in verse 13, he says, don't worry about it. It will provide you an opportunity to bear witness of the truth. Don't worry about what you're going to say. I'll put it in your mouth. Verse 17, you'll be hated of all men for my name's sake. Again, showing that this work, that the Church of God is going to have an impact on the world. You can't be hated of all nations unless you're known of all nations. They're going to be aware, and they're going to hate us as a result of our message. So, then Jesus said in verse 20, when you shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is near. Let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. Let not them that are in the countries enter thereunto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Woe to those that are pregnant with with children, or those that have little infants that are still nursing, because it's going to be a terrible time, a difficult time, and certainly no one will be in having greater difficulties than mothers and young children, because it will be a time of privation, a time of great difficulty. There will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. They'll fall by the edge of the sword, Luke 21:24. They'll be led away captive unto all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's heart failing them for fear, looking after those things coming on the earth. Verse 27, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So we see here that Christ is describing not simply events that centered around the ancient destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., but events that will culminate in his return in power and glory. Now, let me ask you a question. Jesus said, "When you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is near." What did he mean by that? Because, number one, Jerusalem has been compassed with armies many times. I don't know of any city on the face of the earth that's probably been compassed with armies more times than Jerusalem has. Compassed with armies time after time. Now, every time the city has been encompassed with armies, it hasn't been destroyed. It's been destroyed twice. Once by the Babylonians and once by the Romans. The other thing is, if these are hostile armies that are coming at Jerusalem and missiles are firing and tanks are blasting mortar shells and troops are marching in, you know, you don't need an inspired prophecy in the Scripture to tell you the desolation thereof is near. If you're in a place and everybody's coming at you shooting and firing missiles and tanks are coming and all this stuff, you don't need divine revelation to let you know the desolation thereof is near. You figure that out. You look around. The other thing is, if all this is going on around you, that's not a good time for you to say, you know, I think I'm supposed to flee to the mountains. If the group inside the city doesn't shoot you for being a traitor, the group outside will shoot you because they're invading. There's obviously a little more to this statement than just the fact that here are hostile armies pouring in, and when you see the hostile armies pouring in, you better get out. Everybody can figure that out. You know, if the hostile armies are coming in and you have a way out, well, you take it. There's more to the story, isn't there? Let's go back to the book of Daniel. We'll go to Daniel chapter 11. Now, Daniel 11 begins with a story in the first year of Darius the Mede. Darius was the man that Cyrus of Persia left on the throne in Babylon after the fall of Babylon. You remember the account is given in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar seeing the handwriting on the wall and being actually executed that very evening. Darius the Mede was placed on the throne of Babylon and continued in that role for a couple of years until Cyrus returned. Daniel was brought back out of semi-retirement or sort of an enforced retirement, and at least in the beginning period of Persian rule was brought back into a position of prominence, and he was there to help Darius. Now, Daniel 11 contains a continuation of some prophetic revelation that Gabriel the archangel was giving to Daniel. You read that more clearly in the book of Daniel chapter 10, where it goes through and describes that, because the angel speaks to him in Daniel 11 and verse 2. Now will I show you the truth. Behold, there will stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. By his strength, through his riches, he will stir up all against the realm of Greece. And then a mighty king will stand up, ruling with great dominion, do according to his will, and he'll stand up, and when he stands up, his kingdom will be broken and divided to the 4 winds. Now, Daniel 11 gives a little bit of an abbreviated account. Daniel 8 gives more details on that. What you find is the interpretation of these events. In Daniel chapter 11 is talking about the interaction of the Persian kingdom, which had come to power there in his late years, and a future event that lay another 200 years in the future, which was the raising up of a mighty king in Greece. That is made plain in Daniel 8, where he describes a vision of seeing 2 rams, or a ram and a he-goat. In Daniel 8, verse 20, it says the ram represents Media and Persia. And then Daniel 8:21, the rough goat is the king of Greece. The great horn between his eyes is the first king. And being broken, that being broken, four stood up, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Now, this, of course, ties right in with what we see in Daniel 11. It talks about there were future kings of Persia that would be of note, and a fourth king who would be the wealthiest king of Persia, Xerxes. Xerxes put together a huge army of 1 million men to invade Greece. His invasion was unsuccessful, but it certainly stirred up the realm of Greece, and then a number of decades later, Alexander the Great succeeded in uniting the Greek realm under himself, and he crossed from Greece into Asia and defeated the Persians and conquered the Persian Empire. He was the mighty king that should stand up, rule with great dominion. He stretched his empire all the way to India, all the way to Ethiopia, all the way up into Afghanistan. But he only reigned for a short time, as Daniel 11:4 brings out. Daniel 8 also gives the same statement, that he is broken, he dies, and then his kingdom does not go to his son. It is divided to the four winds. Four of his generals, within a couple of decades after Alexander's death, four of his generals had succeeded in dividing the empire of Alexander. They were all Greek. They were all of the same nation, as Daniel 8 said. Daniel 8:22 said, "Four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation." They were Greek language, Greek culture, Greek religion, but divided four different ways. Now, Daniel 11, after mentioning that the empire is divided four ways, from verse 5 on, focuses on only two of those directions. One called the king of the south, and the other the king of the north. That's because the only two of the four divisions in Alexander's empire that continued to interact with Jerusalem and Judea were the kingdoms north and south of Jerusalem. To the north lay the Seleucid kingdom that was centered north of Jerusalem, and south lay the Ptolemaic kingdom centered in Egypt. And so chapter 11 then begins a detailed story of the interaction of these two kings, the descendants of Seleucus in the north and the descendants of Ptolemy in the south. And I'm not going to go through all of these verses, but I will say that most commentaries give a fairly accurate picture of this section, because the history of it was laid out so clear that it's pretty plain when you go through history as to which specific king is talked about. It describes their marriages and wars back and forth. And we come on down through Daniel 11, but what you find is Daniel 11 isn't just about ancient history. Because as you get on down through Daniel 11, by the time you get down to Daniel 11:35, it's talking about, notice the latter part of the verse, even to the time of the end. Verse 40, and at the time of the end. And continuing right on into chapter 12, it talks about, verse 1, a time of trouble, such as never was. It talks about a time when, in verse 2 of Daniel 12, when many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awaken. This is the resurrection. A time when, verse 3, the wise will shine as the brightness of the firmament. Verse 4, Daniel shut up the word, sealed the book, even to the time of the end. So we find that Daniel 11 starts out with a historical progression. But ultimately what Daniel 11 is focused on is not just ancient history. What Daniel 11 is focused on and directs our attention toward is events at the time of the end. Now, as you come on down through the progression of this interaction between the kings of the north and the kings of the south, there was a particular individual that is selected out, a particular man who was one of the kings of the north. He was part of the Seleucid dynasty. His name in history is Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus III, and he is selected out as a type of the end-time beast power. And that is very plain in both Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, because when we get historically to the account of Antiochus, that's when the story slows down in great detail. We've spent all this time, let's say we've spent the first 20 verses getting down to Antiochus, and then when you pick it up in verse 21, you go on through much of the rest of the chapter just focusing on Antiochus. And here you've had, let's say, 200 years or 150 years of history condensed in these earlier verses from about verse 5 to about verse 20. Those 15 verses are about 150 years, and then it slows down and focuses on one individual. We're told that this man, verse 21, who obtained the kingdom, Daniel 11:21, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. In other words, he's going to be a very subtle, crafty individual. He is described as a vile man, a man who is a very corrupt and decadent person, a vile individual. And yet, he is going to not come in with some great army to launch a coup to take over the kingdom. He will come in peaceably and obtain it by flatteries. He's going to make a lot of promises. He's going to be smooth and suave, going to undoubtedly have very good media presence. He's going to be a remarkable individual. Now, back in Daniel 8, when it describes the same thing, Daniel 8, 23, it says, in the latter time of their kingdom, speaking of the Greek kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Again, historically talking about Antiochus, but not just talking about him, as we see as you come on down through the story. Now, historically that referred to Antiochus, but he's described as a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences. An individual who is involved with the occult, with the spirit realm, in communion with spirits. So here is an individual who is involved with that. He will come up, and his power, verse 24, Daniel 8:24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. You know, if you go back to Revelation 13, who provides the power? The dragon, Satan the devil. This individual is going to be a very sharp, intelligent, very capable individual, very smooth, but he is going to be successful not simply as the result of his own power. You know, he's going to have Satan's power. He will destroy wonderfully, we're told in verse 24, shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Now, I think this is a reference to both physical Israel and spiritual Israel. In other words, he's going to launch persecution against the mighty people, certainly the house of Israel, and the holy people, the portion of the church that he's able to attack. Verse 25, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He's going to be very subtle, very clever, have all of these stratagems. He will magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many, or by prosperity. He's going to preside over a short time of peace and prosperity. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Now that certainly goes beyond Antiochus. That goes, the one who is going to stand up against the prince of princes, that's a term that is the superlative. The ultimate prince, the Holy of Holies, the Song of Songs, the Prince of Princes. It is a construction in the Hebrew that is the superlative, the supreme, the ultimate prince. Well, that's Jesus Christ, the Prince of Princes. And this individual will be broken without hand. He won't be destroyed by human endeavor. So this is something that goes beyond Antiochus. It goes to an individual. What do we learn about this individual? That he is certainly in contact with the demonic world, that he is going to do various things. He will certainly magnify himself. And Now, as we come on back here to Daniel 11, let's notice this vile person stands up. He obtains the kingdom peaceably through flattery. Then, notice verse 22 of Daniel 11. With the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken. Yes, also the prince of the covenant. Now, the prince of the covenant historically referred to the high priest. He was the leader of the covenant people. He occupied the highest office of the covenant people, and so it describes describes that. Notice verse 23. After the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even unto the fattest places of the province. He shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and the spoil and riches. Yes, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time, his clever strategies to take the whole place. Now, notice here, verse 23 describes a league, a covenant, a treaty that is made. After this league is made, he will work deceitfully. He'll be strong with a small people, and will enter peaceably into the fattest places of the province. Now, this is talking again to the role, certainly typically this is what occurred in type back at the time of Antiochus, but this talks about an individual who is going to gain peaceful access. He's actually going to make an agreement. He's going to make a league. But he's not going to keep the agreement that he makes. Now, when you look in Luke 21 and you read about what Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then you know the desolation is near. These armies ostensibly are not going to be hostile armies. These armies are going to be peacekeeping forces. Quote unquote, peacekeeping forces. Peacekeeping forces brought about by this individual, this vile individual, this individual who is in reality in communion with the demonic world, an individual who's going to be very slick, very clever, very suave and sophisticated, an individual who will use flattery, who will use all sorts of public relations techniques to sort of ensconce himself in power, an individual who will make an agreement there in the Middle East, but will act deceitfully in the aftermath of that agreement, will use that agreement to introduce, quote, peacekeeping forces in. He will enter peaceably into the fattest portions of the province. He's going to be able to do what none of his predecessors have ever done. He's going to be there, but then he's going to forecast his devices against the strongholds. He has a plan. They come in, you see, and this is what occurs. As you come on down in verse 31 of Daniel 11, arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. They shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. They'll take away the daily sacrifice and place the abomination that makes desolate. Now, Antiochus did. The wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But you go your way till the end be. For you shall rest and stand in your lot at the end of the days. When does this prophecy conclude? Well, Daniel is told that he's going to die. He's going to get old and die. He was already in his 80s by the time this is said. You'll rest. You're going to go to sleep. You see, all that sleep, and this is a time, Daniel 12:2 talks about a time when many that sleep in the earth, dust of the earth shall awaken. Daniel is going to rest in the grave, in the dust of the earth, and he's going to awaken and stand in his lot, his portion. When is Daniel going to receive his inheritance, his portion? When is Daniel going to stand up from the dust of the ground? At the resurrection. Daniel 12:13 refers to it at the end of the days. Verse 11 and 12 talk about two periods of days, 1,290 days and 1,335 days. That's a month and a half difference, 45 days difference. Now, if you have two periods of time that are of unequal length, they can either end at the same time and begin at different times, or they can begin at the same time and end at different times. But you know, they can't do both. Well, do these days begin at the same time, or do they end at the same time? Well, they end at the same time. Daniel will stand in his lot at the end of the days, and just in the preceding two verses mentions these periods of days. So 1,335 days, 1,290 days end at the time when Daniel will stand up out of the dust of the ground at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What event is going to occur 1,290 days before the resurrection? The daily sacrifice will be taken away and the abomination that makes desolate set up. Now, in Matthew 24, Jesus Christ makes reference to this exact verse that we just read. You remember Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said in verse 14, Matthew 24:14, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come. When you," verse 15, "when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. Whoso reads, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out." So he goes on and talks about getting out of there, because, verse 21, the result is there shall be great tribulation, such as has never been. Now that is, of course, the same description that is mentioned in Daniel 12 and verse 1, a time of trouble such as there never was. You can't have multiple times when there's trouble worse than there ever was. So we find that there is an event that is going to happen, that there is an abomination set up that will lead to desolation. When we read in Daniel chapter 11, we read about an individual who comes in, enters peaceably. Well, first he makes a league, after which he works deceitfully. So he makes an agreement that enables him to peaceably come in, to provide peacekeeping troops. He comes in, initially with a small force, enters in peaceably, but you see, he has a plan that is going to turn everything upside down. Daniel 11 alludes to that. That's why Jesus said in Luke 21, "When you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, know the desolation thereof is near." Others think these are peacekeeping troops. They're peacekeeping, all right. They're there to keep a piece of this and a piece of that and a piece of something else. You see, there is a lull. There is an individual there who has come in and through various strategies and flatteries and through entering into an agreement and a guarantee has provided a guarantee for the Jews, has allowed certain things to take place, has troops there in the area, Christ said, when you see that, you had better get out and get out quickly. Now, there's going to, first the daily sacrifice will be taken away. You see, that's when he betrays the league or the agreement that he made. He takes away the daily sacrifices, puts a halt to that. And then, there on that place where God has set his name for forever. I mean, the New Jerusalem is going to come down from heaven and be located, centered right there. You know how the Temple Mount was chosen? You can go back and read the account in Chronicles. King David looked up. The plague was on the land, and he looked up and he saw a great mighty angel with a sword in his hand, drawn. I want to tell you, if you look up and you see a great glowing, powerful angel, that'd scare you pretty well to death. But if you see him and he looks mad and he's got a sword out, believe me, that's worse. It's bad enough. He's here and he's great and powerful, but he doesn't look very happy and he's got his sword out. Well, needless to say, David, as you read the account in First Chronicles, David fell on his face, besought God for mercy. And as you go on through the story, you see that the angel took the sword which he had out and put it in his scabbard. He put the sword up, and it tells you that the angel was there standing, suspended between heaven and earth, over the exact spot where then David built the altar, where the temple was built, right over that area that became the Holy of Holies. God chose the spot in a miraculous way, set his name there, and you can go all the way on through the story. Antiochus put up a statue of Jupiter Olympus. You know, it's interesting that there is a great big statue of Jupiter Olympus that's still kicking around, and it has great religious prominence. It's over 2,000 years old. There's a statue. There, of course, were multiple statues of Jupiter Olympus, but there's a statue of Jupiter Olympus that's at least 2,000 years old. It was at the temple of Jupiter there in Rome. But then Emperor Constantine got religion, if you remember, got Catholic religion. And so when he did, he built a big palace for the Bishop of Rome, and they took the statue, this big ebony statue of Jupiter, out of the temple of Jupiter, and it was holding a scepter. And so they cut off the scepter, and they inserted a ring of keys into the hand in place of the scepter. And they carried it over there and set it up in the new bishop's palace. And it's still there. It's been moved from the bishop's palace when they built a new cathedral called St. Peter's. You see, all they had to do to the statue of Jupiter was sprinkle a little holy water on him and say, you were Jupiter, now you're St. Pete. And it's still there. At least most of it is still there. The big toe is gone. Been so many millions of people that have come by there and kissed the toe that it's literally worn away flat over the centuries. And it's just, sort of worn away. I don't know how many million people have come by there, but I was talking after the sermon this morning in Dallas. I was talking with Henry Wilson, and he's actually been over there and seen the statue. And when he was telling that, I said, well, did you kiss the toe? And needless to say, he flared up as only an Irishman can flare up. No, absolutely not. Well, I knew that. I just wanted to sort of see what he would have to say. But he did vouch for the fact that, just as I've read, the toe has been worn away. I mean, it's sort of worn down flat. So many millions of people, you just see them all coming through there, and they're all bowing down, kissing this big, black statue of St. Pete, which really isn't St. Peter. I think probably, if you look at a picture of the statue, I think probably a statue of Nimrod is what the original model for the statue was. But it's interesting that there was a statue just like that Antiochus set up in the temple. Are they going to move when they move out of Rome to Jerusalem? Are they going to take that particular statue along with them? Well, I don't know, but they're not going to be there and not set up all sorts of idolatrous trappings because there are going to be statues of this and that and crucifixes and all sorts of junk. It's going to be hanging around there wherever this crowd is. You can read more about it. The point is that Luke 21, let's begin to sort of wrap some of this up. Luke 21 says that in verse 20, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is near. You see, first comes the peaceful entry, the league, followed by the peaceful entry, the armies now surrounding. Then comes a betrayal, a cessation of daily sacrifices, and an abomination, this idolatrous system standing on the place that God specifically picked, and an individual undoubtedly possessed, the very devil himself speaking through this individual standing there proclaiming himself to be God in the very place where the throne of Jesus Christ is going to be placed, the very place where God had set his name. Well, that's an abomination. Christ said, when you see Jerusalem, and that will lead to the desolation of Jerusalem, and he says, when you see the armies, know the desolation's getting near. That's when you'd better get out. Because you see, Zechariah 14 talks about that all nations will gather their troops there, all nations against Jerusalem to battle. So it's going to be we call that a multinational force. The all nations. Maybe you could even translate that the United Nations, you see. All nations, great multinational force led by this individual, or who is going to be controlled by this individual who has come to power in Europe, who is very subtle and very crafty, and yet is a vile, despicable individual. An individual who is actually in communion with the devil himself, understanding dark sentences. Then we find that the city will be taken, and half the city will go into captivity. Which half? The Jewish half. You see, Luke 21 says in verse 24, they'll fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. How long? Well, that's what Revelation 11 tells us. Revelation 11 talks about, in verse 2, the latter part of the verse, it is given unto the Gentiles, in the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. Jerusalem trodden down of the Gentiles till the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. It will be completed, you see, when Christ returns. How long will the Gentiles tread down the holy city? Well, Revelation 11, 2 says they'll tread it down 42 months. Now, you see, you start lining up these days. The period of 1,335 days, which leads up, that's the longest period. I think that that events are going to occur right around that time, that it is that period, that, let's say, 45-day period between the beginning of this countdown of 1,335 days. We're not told a specific event that occurs, but that period of 45 days leading up until the daily sacrifices are stopped is undoubtedly going to be a time when God's people are in process of travel and of getting out of Jerusalem, because when the daily sacrifices stopped, the abomination is set up, and then you're not going to be able to get out of Jerusalem in the aftermath of that once the armies overtly turn hostile. And then you have 30 more days after the sacrifice is taken away before the complete destruction of and taking into captivity of the city. You see, there's an interesting statement back in the book of Hosea. Let's just very briefly notice. Hosea, this is, I think, back chapter 5. Hosea 5:5, the pride of Israel does testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah also shall fall with them. That never happened historically. Judah did not fall when Israel fell in ancient history. Israel and Ephraim shall fall in their iniquity. Judah shall fall with them. Notice verse 7. They have dealt treacherously against the Lord. They have begotten strange children. Now shall a month devour them with their portions. You know the difference in time between the time when the daily sacrifice is taken away and the time when the holy city is completely trodden down of the Gentiles begins that period. You know, one is 1,290 days and the other is 1,260, 30 days in between. What happens during that 30 days? The answer is Hosea 5:7. A month shall devour them with their portions. It takes a month to basically, it is that month in the aftermath of the sacrifices being taken away that will see the destruction of Israel and Judah and the beginning of deportation into captivity. So during that final 1,260 days, the church will be in her place in the wilderness, described in Revelation chapter 12. And I see we don't have time to get on into that. I had some other things. I'm always optimistic about how much I'm going to fit in, and it seems like doesn't work that way. But anyway, let's conclude back here in Luke chapter 21. You see, as we see things happening on the world scene, and we see these events going on involving the peace talks, we see these things beginning to build, and we're going to see great significant events happen in Europe that are going to set the stage for things to happen in the Middle East. Well, Christ goes on, and he says in verse 36, well, in verse 33, let's pick it up, Luke 21:33. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch you therefore, and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all of these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. We're told to watch and to pray. To watch is to be alert. It's not just simply, well, make sure you turn on the 6 o'clock news. That's not the main thing Christ was after. Yes, to be aware of what's happening in the world around us, but people, got folks at CNN, their full-time job is keeping up with news. But they don't understand what it means. They were caught by surprise when the events happened in Europe in 1989, and they're going to be caught by surprise when these things unfold. Watch in the sense of being alert. Don't go to sleep at the switch. The world's going to be taken by surprise. Be alert, be aware, be awake, and be praying, be walking with God. Then you can be accounted worthy to escape. There is a way of escape. Christ said, if you're alert, and you're really walking with God, then you may be accounted worthy to escape these things that are going to come to pass. Notice what he said. Our attitude ought to be in verse 28. When these things begin to come to pass, he didn't say go get scared and hide in a corner. When these things begin to come to pass, then look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. You see, as we see events that are going to be very frightening to the world around us, we're told we don't have to be scared. What we need to do is, number one, walk with God. And number two, realize as these things begin to happen that our redemption draws near. Brethren, I think as we look around, it's interesting. I'll just make one other comment. A number of years ago, as things began to happen in the church, I think many thought, the great test, if we know what the truth is, we hold on to the right doctrine, we hold on to the truth. That's the big test. Well, that's an important test, and it's vitally important to hold on to the truth. But that wasn't the last test. That's not the only test there is. We're tested not only about faithfulness to the truth, we're tested in terms of faith, We're going to be tested in terms of humility. We're going to be tested in terms of commitment. We're going to be tested in terms of love. You know, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. We're tested in all of these areas. We go through circumstances that we not only have to be faithful to the truth, we have to, yes, to be committed, yes, to trust God, yes, to love God, and to love one another. You know, that's pretty vital. Christ had an awful lot to say about that, and that gets into a different subject. We're tested on all these things, and we've seen those tests. And, you know, they're going to continue. We don't have to be frightened. We don't have to worry and be filled with anxiety. No, Christ said, look up and lift up your head, because it's getting close. Your redemption draws